нагоди 90-х роковин Голодомору мережа нащадків Голодомору та Світова координаційна виховно-освітня рада Світового конгресу українців створили проект усних розповідей для учнів 8-12 класів. Ми пам'ятаємо. Сьогодні пропонуємо 8-й епізод із цієї серії.
Oleksiy Buchuk, student of the Ridna Shkola of the American Ukrainian Youth Association, Dmytro Vitovskyj Branch. The interview with Holodomor descendant, Daniel Kugler.
What does the Holodomor mean to you?
To me, it means a tragedy that happened to the Ukrainian nation. It has an effect on the country to this day and highlights the importance of learning our history because it was forbidden to talk about in Ukraine for a long time. So I think it's important to remember it and to value our ancestors and what they went through.
Tell me about your relatives that survived the Holodomor. What are their names? Where were they born?
Both of my grandparents on my mother's side were born in Kievsky Oblast. They were villagers. My grandmother was from a place called Vasilivka, which is now named Podila. And she was on the Hutor, which is a small village off the bigger village. She was, a young child during it, but she remembered, just the feeling of hunger, and she remembered soldiers coming into their house and looking for grain, and there wasn't any grain, but they were searching all over. One of the most horrific memories that she passed on to me is when she walked to school. The school is in another village, so she would walk to school, and at the end of her village, they would walk past a place where they were burying people that starved. It was basically a big pit where she remembered walking by there, and they were pulling a bunch of bodies to dump in there, and the girl was yelling, "Don't bury me, I'm not dead yet." Difficult to imagine, a young person going through something like that, seeing that, living their life after that. They had a little more than other people did, because I believe her mother worked with the cows in the kolkhoz, and they had a little more access to milk. She would tell me about that, they sold all the gold and icons and silver, everything they had in their house, to get money to buy food. They would walk to Kiev, 80 kilometers or so. Her father did, my great-grandfather, and he was named Ivan Vasilivka. She remembered one time that she accompanied him. They were bringing a big ornamental carpet that they had and to sell. There were many people, many villagers that went there to sell whatever they had to the city to try to get some money to buy simple foods. When they got there with the rug, there was some people that somehow pulled at my grandmother really hard, and then my great-grandfather kind of tried to push them off her, and then they were working as a team, and then they stole the rug, so they walked all that way for nothing. It was very desperate times. And what's interesting is that she freely talked about it. She came to America. Her sisters didn't talk about it for a long time. One never did, and to the point of saying it didn't happen, and the other one started to after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Kiev was more independent and she felt safe to talk about it. But I think that's a significant thing to think about, is how many people didn't tell these stories because they were afraid for themselves or for their children to pass on these stories to, that they could get in trouble with the Soviet government, and so that had a lasting effect, I think, on Ukrainian history. So it's important to tell these stories. My grandfather was Petro Malezhik. He was from a village called Sosnikiv, also in Kievsky Oblast. He was a little older. I believe he was born in the 1910s, but he was an orphan. He lived with his older brother and his younger sister, and they were kulaks, what was called a wealthy, landowner. They were not particularly wealthy. They did have a horse and a stable boy, but they were deemed enemies of the state because they had this certain amount of land, and the government was taking private land and restructuring it at that time. So my grandfather's older brother during that time, I can't quite understand this, but what I was explained to me was that he thought that if he left just the two children, that they wouldn't harm them. So he had actually moved to Russia, escaped to Russia, where they weren't, doing that. But they still took away their home. And my grandfather and his sister, is young teenagers, about your age, I think, lived in the forest of the village, and other people moved into their house. Although they were orphans, basically powerless people, they were treated as, wealthy landowners. So they lived in the forest, actually, during the Holodomor. They survived by eating mushrooms. My grandfather never liked to eat mushrooms. He was great at picking them because he knew everything to do, but as an adult, he didn't want to eat them because he lived on them during the famine. And he would talk to me about how they would mix like mushrooms and leaves and even like bark and pieces of wood, that doesn't give any nutrients really, but they just wanted to eat whatever they could have. Eventually, they were taken in by a woman who was the poorest woman in the village. She was a widow, and she said, well, they can't do anything to me because I'm so poor already. So she took them in and helped them. He basically just barely survived.
Do you believe that there's any similarity between the current genocide in Ukraine and the Holodomor genocide?
I think there's a lot of parallels, and even just so much of Ukrainian identity was damaged, I think, in the 1930s by how many people were killed in Ukraine, that depopulated all these villages, and that other people came to live there, and it changed the culture and changed the cultural memory of the country. And I think it's important that we remember this, support Ukraine in defending itself, because I don't think these horrors just could happen once. I think the same attitudes are at play now.